In April 1966, as most of the continent was finding its way to independence, Haiti took center stage in Africa, quite literally so. That month, Aimé Césaire's play about the early Haitian leader Henri Christophe was staged in Dakar, Senegal. This was a red letter event in the history of Black internationalism, and it highlights the historical connection between the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804 and the decolonization of Africa over 150 years later. In a sense, the collapse of the first French colonial empire came face to face with the collapse of the second. Here was a play about the Haitian Revolution and its aftermath, written by one of the fathers of Negritude, staged in the former capital of French West Africa on the invitation of one of the other fathers of Negritude, featuring a cast of Haitians and Africans and performed in front of towering Black artists and intellectuals from across the planet. The audience was a veritable who's who of Black cosmopolitans. It included Duke Ellington, Josephine Baker, James Baldwin, Léon Gontran Damas, Alioune Diop, Haile Selassie, Catherine Dunham, Langston Hughes, and Leopold Sédar Senghor, and many others. The performance was a part of a weeks-long festival, the first Festival Mondial des Arts Nègres, which Senghor's government had organized in collaboration with UNESCO. The intention was to celebrate the contributions of Black people to global art and culture, and to establish links between the young state and the international community. For 24 days in April, Black luminaries in music, literature, dance, filmmaking, philosophy, visual art, and theater convened in Dakar for a marathon of exhibitions, lectures, performances, and pageantry. Here at the Daniel Sorano National Theatre, La Tragédie du Roi Christophe made its African debut. The play invokes Haitian history to issue a warning to Africa. The plot revolves around Henri Christophe as the leader of a newly independent nation, built on the notion of Black dignity and equality for all, who nevertheless betrays the promise of liberty in pursuit of national and personal grandeur. Christophe attempts to build an imposing citadel, a monument to Haiti's historical significance, and ends up essentially re-enslaving his subjects in order to carry out this grandiose scheme. Ultimately, Christophe meets a tragic end. The play is considered one of Césaire's finest literary achievements, and many commentators have noted the author's apparent motivation of issuing a warning for the nascent African states and their leaders. Césaire understood the neo-colonial potential of new African leaders and used his play to depict what could happen if the interests of the African masses were subordinated to state-building schemes or the personal aspirations of presidents. If the dramatic events of Haiti's history contained a warning, so too did its contemporary situation. In 1966, for the past 6 years, Haiti had been under the control of President François Duvalier. 2 years earlier, Duvalier had declared himself president for life, and his grip on Haitian society had grown more and more destructive. He targeted opponents of his regime and crippled independent institutions like the legislature, the Catholic Church, and the military. Duvalier's oppressive regime triggered a mass exodus, which included a considerable portion of the country's professionals and intelligentsia, and many more desperate peasants. Hundreds of thousands of Haitians escaped Duvalier's Haiti and settled in cities like New York, Montreal, Miami, and Paris. Some also took root in Africa, where they hoped to find a more settled existence and to contribute to the development of newly independent nations in the Haitian people's ancestral homeland. But these weren't the first Haitians to travel to Africa. Haitians had been visiting Africa for a variety of reasons since at least 1896. Today, I'm going to introduce you to some of these individuals and sketch a narrative from the first known Haitian to travel to Africa in the 1890s to visit the Emperor of Ethiopia, to the community of Haitians who laid down roots in Dakar in the 1960s and contributed directly to the nation building project there. For the past decade, I've been obsessed with Haiti. My master's thesis focused on language politics in the 20th century. And for my current dissertation, I'm taking a broad view of the role of Haiti, Haitians, and the Haitian Revolution as a point of reference for the later French colonial empire in Africa. Given the state of the world, my dissertation is moving along slowly so far, but I'm gradually piecing together a complicated picture of the legacy of Saint-Domingue and the Haitian Revolution in French Africa, both as a constructive force from the French perspective, a force that guided the activities of French colonialists, and also as a destructive force, again, from the French perspective, which challenged the ideas of the right of Europeans to dominate Africa. Today, I'm going to give a brief overview of my dissertation as a whole, and then I'm going to focus on a particular chapter. So in the first section of the dissertation, I look at the memory of Saint-Domingue, the model French colony, and the way it inspired early incursion into Africa. One military officer involved with the conquest of Algiers in 1830, for instance, wrote of a colony that would help us forget about Saint-Domingue. Furthermore, I examine how the lessons the French gleaned from the Haitian Revolution shaped their views of the best and worst case scenarios in the colonies, of Africans in general, of slavery and coerced labor, and of the extension of political rights to colonial subjects. I then turn from French Africa to France itself. By the heyday of French colonialism in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, a growing Haitian community had taken root in Paris. As people of African descent and citizens of a former French colony that had won its independence through armed rebellion, Haitians in Paris had a unique perspective on French colonialism in Africa, and some were vocal about it. Although some Haitians were supportive of the goals of empire to civilize Africans, others were more critical. They engaged in debates on colonialism. They helped organize Pan-African conferences. They gave lectures and printed books and articles condemning scientific racism and European exploitation of their colonial domains. A key active member of this Haitian community was a naval officer, a lawyer, and a newspaperman named Benito Sylvain, whom I will talk more about in a few minutes. In the final section of my dissertation, I turn back to Africa, and I look at the role of Haiti in the decolonization of French Africa. First, I look at African independence leaders like Léopold Sédar Senghor and Ahmed Sékou Touré, and I try to uncover the role Haiti played in their thinking and communication about French colonialism in Africa and African self-rule. Finally, in the last chapter of my dissertation, I focus on the direct impact of Haitians on Africa. In the 20th century, thousands of Haitians traveled to Africa for a variety of reasons. This is the chapter that I'm going to speak about today. The reverse migration of people of African descent back to Africa is a relatively understudied chapter in the history of migrations. There have certainly been books about Liberia in the 19th century and about Black Americans traveling as experts to places like Ghana in the 20th century, but it is nonetheless something of an embryonic field. Furthermore, many scholars have noted a consistent Afro-Saxon bias that has characterized academic work on Black internationalism, leaving events in the French Black Atlantic to literary scholars. Despite a growing interest in Haiti and its diaspora in recent years, virtually nothing has been written about Haitians in Africa. A rare exception is an article by Regine O. Jackson, a leading expert of Haitian diaspora studies, which looks at Haitian medical workers who traveled to Congo-Kinshasa in the 1960s under the auspices of the United Nations. In this article, Jackson articulates several important guidelines for thinking about Haitians in Africa. She says that new interpretive frames are needed to see migration to post-colonial Africa as a part of a long tradition of Haitian internationalism. She remarks that certain interpretations of Haitian immigration to the Congo seem to challenge the very logic of powerful discursive frames. She explains that categories like exile and brain drain neglect important dimensions of migrant subjectivities, while the term expatriate connotes not only whiteness, but also lavish lifestyles, hedonistic pleasures, and social irresponsibility. She concludes that this failure of categories narrows our ability to imagine how Haitians contributed to the project of mid-20th century Black internationalism, as well as our modes of theorizing the Haitian diaspora. So this final chapter of my dissertation is a part of a wider attempt to break from preconceptions of 20th century migrations and take the scope of global and transnational histories in new, unexamined directions. I've divided my analysis of Haitian migrations to Africa into three categories. First, I look at Haitians who traveled to Africa in the colonial period and whom I refer to as the pioneers. I use this term conscientiously. On the one hand, they certainly laid a trail that later Haitians followed. On the other, like the pioneers of the United States frontier, they were in some ways complicit in the colonialist system. The second group I want to look at are the Haitians who were involved with African decolonization from above. I refer to these as the supranationals. Essentially, I'm referring to the Haitians who were directly involved in supranational policymaking and who led UN missions to Africa. Finally, I'll focus on representatives of the Haitian community in Dakar and examine how they contributed to decolonization and nation building from below. For want of a better term, and despite Regine Jackson's injunction, I'm referring to this group for now as the expatriates. So first, the pioneers. In a 1989 study of Haitian culture, the eminent scholar of Haitian literature, Léon-François Hoffman, wrote that as far as he could determine, only 3 Haitians had any firsthand experience of Africa between 1804 and 1935. Of course, Saint-Domingue was still importing large numbers of enslaved people from Africa right up to the time of the revolution. so many of Haiti's early citizens were undoubtedly born in Africa. Yet Hoffman was unable to find more than 3 Haitians who set foot on the African continent in this period, 1804 to 1935. Although much of Haitian culture is certainly derived from African antecedents, Haiti was isolated from Africa for much of its early existence. The 3 people Hoffman identifies are Félix Darfour, Benito Sylvain, and Désiré Baker. Darfour is believed to have been born in the Sudan region in the mid-18th century, hence his name. He somehow made his way to France for an education and from Haiti, where he worked as a journalist. In the 1820s, he criticized Boyer's government for its marginalization of dark-skinned Haitians. For this supposed sedition, Darfour was tried in a military court, although he wasn't in the army, and executed in 1822. This is undoubtedly an interesting event in Haitian French African transnational history. But since Darfour was not a Haitian in Africa, we need not dwell on his story here. Hoffman's second and third cases, however, are extremely relevant for the current study. Unfortunately, I have not yet been able to find out much about Désiré Baker. It seems he was a Catholic missionary in French West Africa in the 1930s. In 1935, Baker published a book entitled Dans les brousses africaines. According to Hoffman, the book gives no indication besides the photo of its author of his national or ethnic origin, and that in the book, one can find the mixture of irony and condescension characteristic of accounts of travels in Africa. I'm hoping to learn more about this interesting figure, but needless to say, he seems to have been a pioneer in the colonialist sense, contributing to rather than challenging European activities in Africa, despite his Haitian identity. The third individual that Hoffman notes is better known, and his relationship with Africa is more complex. Benito Sylvain was a Haitian naval officer and lawyer who in the 1890s had taken up residence in Paris and established himself as a newspaper publisher. His paper, La Fraternité, was dedicated to Haitian and African interests, and he earned a reputation as a spokesman for the city's growing Black population. He served as president of the Black Youth Organization and the Ethnographical Society's Oriental and African Committee, and helped establish a Foreign Students Association. He gave public lectures condemning slavery in Africa, condemning social Darwinism, and the excesses of European colonialism. But for our purposes, he is most significant as the first known Haitian to travel to Africa. In the 1890s, Ethiopia stood out as one of the last uncolonized regions of the continent. In 1896, the Italians attempted to conquer the territory, but were famously defeated at the Battle of Adwa. European powers then sought to establish informal ties with Ethiopia. In spring 1897, Benito Sylvain traveled to the region under the auspices of the French alliance. In Addis Ababa, he met with Emperor Menelik II, who, according to Sylvain's account, welcomed him as a representative of Black civilization in the Americas and gave him the honorary title of aide de camp. By June, Sylvain was back in Paris, where he gave seminars describing his experience and his impressions of Africa. He then returned to Ethiopia 3 times between 1897 and 1906. According to Sylvain's own testimony, he was in Africa as an agent of French colonialism. In a newspaper article, he said, "I believed I could be of service to the French cause in Ethiopia, and I solicited a delegation for the great African empire whose friendship Europeans are currently fighting for, Ethiopia." He believed colonialism could benefit both colonizer and colonized. Despite the racism he no doubt faced daily as a Black Parisian, he believed in the ideal of an anti-racist France. He was a devoted supporter of Western civilization and believed it had much to offer Africa. As such, he did not object to European colonialism outright. It would be inaccurate, however, to think of Sylvain as simply an agent of French colonialism. His views were affected by his attachment to Western civilization on one hand, but also his Haitian identity on the other. Moreover, his views evolved over the course of his life. He was fiercely opposed to European excesses in the colonies and speculated on the eventual possibility of a sovereign, united Africa. After his first trip to Africa, he went on to help organize the first Pan-African Conference in London in 1900. In 1901, he completed a doctorate in law, defending a thesis entitled De la Sort des Indigènes dans les colonies d'exploitation. In this work, Sylvain explores the past, present, and future of colonialism. He looks at the past of places like Haiti and Cuba and notes that nations that base their colonial system on violence and oppression are doomed to lose their colonies. He exposes and denounces the contemporary abuses on the part of European colonists. Finally, he looks at the future of colonialism. Here, he lays out a view of what he sees as the best case scenario for colonialism in Africa. Essentially, he believes that European colonialism has the capacity to be a productive force, bringing resources to Europe and civilization to Africa. As such, Sylvain reveals himself to be fundamentally in favor of colonialism. Yet again, it would be too simplistic to call him a blind apostle of European imperialism. In theory, there was little to differentiate him from his white European contemporaries who called for the civilization of Africa through benevolent imperialism. Yet his concerted efforts to oppose the abuses of colonialism and to build connections within Africa and between Africa and its diaspora certainly distinguished him as someone who truly sympathized with the African people. A third individual who can be placed in the pioneers category is actually Benito Sylvain's niece, Suzanne Comère-Sylvain. Born in 1898, Comère-Sylvain was an anthropologist who trained under Bronislaw Malinowski and Alfred Métraux. She made numerous trips to Africa for fieldwork, beginning in 1943 and ending with her untimely death in Nigeria in 1975 at the age of 76. As such, she is one of the few Haitians who truly knew colonial and post-colonial Africa. Given her discipline and the span of time encompassing her travels, Suzanne Comère-Sylvain represents a transition in this history of Haitian experiences in Africa. Edward Said reminds us that the production of knowledge is a function of colonialism. Colonizing nations produce and claim a monopoly on knowledge about colonized nations, which reinforces domination. Emmanuel Sibeux has described how the field of anthropology in particular served as a tool for colonialism by demonstrating supposed racial differences between civilized colonists and backward colonial subjects. The relationship was also mutual, as anthropologists relied on the colonial system to obtain artifacts and human bones for their research. Suzanne Comère-Sylvain, as a researcher affiliated with Western universities, she can certainly be considered part of the colonialist system. Colonialism gave Comère-Sylvain the occasion and the impetus to carry out her fieldwork in the Belgian Congo in the 1940s. She studied at the Sorbonne, and it is unsurprising that her early writings betray a bias in favor of a European standard. However, as Emmanuel Sibeux also explains, the field of anthropology was itself in flux in the first half of the 20th century. After the First World War, anthropologists grew more skeptical of the concept of a biological race and began to cast doubts on the idea of inherent differences between people groups that formed part of the justification of imperialism. Furthermore, developments in Haiti over the first half of the 20th century must also have impacted Comère-Sylvain's view of imperialism, race, and culture, and by extension, her view of her own work. Between 1915 and 1934, the United States occupied Haiti. The occupation revitalized anti-colonialism in Haiti. Several members of Comère-Sylvain's family were outspoken critics of the occupation, in particular her famous father, Georges Sylvain, and her brother, Normile Sylvain. Normile became a leading figure in a literary and intellectual movement that emerged in Haiti in response to the US occupation. The indigeniste movement opposed the civilizing agenda of the occupation by devoting new interest to and placing greater value on African aspects of Haitian culture. Indigenistes studied Haitian folklore, the voodoo religion, the Creole language, and Haitian cultural practices, and worked to promote Haiti's African heritage. Indigenisme had a major impact on Haitian views of Africa generally, and also had direct reverberations in Africa, as Haitian indigenisme was one of the major influences of Negritude. Like her brother Normile, Suzanne is also associated with indigenisme. For nearly 4 decades, she studied languages, folklore, and cultural practices in Haiti and in Africa, and worked to find connections between the two. From 1937 to 1941, she did fieldwork in Haiti, focusing on oral traditions. And then from 1943 to 1945, she was in the Belgian Congo, where she studied the lives of women and youths in Leopoldville. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, she did more fieldwork in Haiti. And then by 1965, now in her late 60s, she was back in what was now independent Zaire, where she continued her work among urban women in what was now Kinshasa. She published a monograph on this topic the year she turned 70. She ultimately settled in Nigeria, where she continued to do research and work at the University of Nsukka, and where she died unexpectedly in a car crash at the age of 76. Suzanne Comelle-Sylvain thus represents a shift in the story of Haiti and Africa. Whereas earlier individuals like Benito Sylvain understood Africa through the lens of a French cultural worldview, by the middle of the 20th century, some Haitians were starting to think about Africa on its own terms. Incidentally, and at the risk of making this presentation entirely about the Sylvain family, Benito and Suzanne were not the only two Sylvains to spend time in Africa. At least 3 of Suzanne's siblings lived on the continent for at least part of their lives. Her sister Yvonne was Haiti's first female doctor, an OBGYN and a cancer researcher, who worked tirelessly to tackle the medical problems facing impoverished people in Haiti and elsewhere. Her expertise brought her to Nigeria and Senegal, and she worked with the WHO. Another sister, Madeleine, was a sociologist and a feminist who worked for the United Nations, and in the late 1960s worked as a community development advisor for the government of Togo. Their brother Pierre was a horticulturist who worked as a coffee specialist for the Food and Agriculture Organization in Addis Ababa. Finally, Suzanne's niece, Raymonde Sylvain, was a history student at the Sorbonne in 1950 when she met a Senegalese history student named Amadou Makhtar Mbao. The two got married in 1951 and settled in Dakar. Mbao went on to serve as Minister of Education and then of Culture and Youth Affairs in the 1960s, before working for UNESCO, ultimately serving as its Director General from 1974 to 1987. So apparently Benito Sylvain set a strong example for his nieces and nephews. But besides their long connection to Africa, the Sylvain family members listed above also share another connection that leads us to my second category of Haitians in Africa. Most of them worked at the United Nations. Haitians have played a part in the UN since its inception. Many of them took a particular interest in developments in Africa in the 1950s and 1960s. And some even played an important role in the decolonization of Africa under the auspices of the United Nations. Literally thousands of Haitians traveled to Africa with the various UN agencies. But today I'm going to focus on 2 individuals who very clearly engage with African decolonization from above. The first is Émile Saint-Lô. Saint-Lô had been a senator and a cabinet minister in the relatively progressive government of Dumarsais-Estimé in the aftermath of the so-called Revolution of 1946 in Haiti. He was part of the Noiriste faction, a form of Black power that was gaining popularity in Haiti in the 1940s. It was essentially a populist race-based movement that promoted the Black petty bourgeoisie in opposition to the traditional light-skinned elites. He was a member of the body that drafted the Haitian Constitution of 1946. Saint-Lô seems to have had a contentious relationship with the president, Estimé, and like many Haitians that have been at odds with the person in power, he ended up in a diplomatic post, possibly so the president could keep him at a distance. Haiti was one of the founding member states of the United Nations, and Émile Saint-Lô was appointed Haiti's first ambassador to the organization. In 1947, he traveled to New York City to take part in the UN's earliest activities. One of his first duties was to participate in the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In August 1948, the drafting subcommittee submitted a version of the declaration to the United Nations Third Committee, the Committee on Social, Humanitarian, and Cultural Issues, of which Émile Saint-Lô was a member. In the Palais de Chaillot in Paris, representatives of the 51 member states convened for 81 meetings between September 30th and December 7th, 1948, to discuss and debate the document. Saint-Lô and his colleagues on the Third Committee understood Haiti's significance in the global development of human rights, and he was accorded a degree of esteem in the chamber. Over the course of the meetings, he served as rapporteur and occasionally as chairperson. He was an active member of the debates, and he conscientiously took up the cause of colonial peoples. In his first statement on record, he said, Haiti wished to lend its support to all those who fought for freedom, equality, and justice, and would do its utmost to make the declaration not an abstract document, but an instrument of practical value to the oppressed everywhere. Early on, he urged the committee to draft an international covenant that would bind nations to implement human rights guarantees, lest, quote, states and people would come to the conclusion that the United Nations was merely formulating principles which were meaningless, as no provisions had been made for their implementation. Later, he argued against the strict Western notion of individualism present in the text, saying the doctrine of individualism carried to excess had brought about the reaction of totalitarianism, and an attempt should be made to avoid either extreme. On this point, he drafted an amendment which changed the article, "Everyone has the right to own property alone or in association with others," adding the phrase, "This right shall be exercised in conformity with the public interest." This was rejected by a vote of 18 to 11 with 12 abstentions. He also opposed the stipulation that elections should take place by secret ballot, saying that illiterate people would thus be excluded from voting and the suffrage would no longer be universal. He went on to allude to the Haitian Revolution, saying that hundreds of thousands of inhabitants of his country who had been unable to read and write had still had the courage to fight for their independence. He then subtly criticized colonialism, saying that illiteracy was usually the result of oppression of the masses by the minority in control and was no reason to deprive human beings of civil rights. Ultimately, he called for a vote to remove by secret ballot from the article and instead simply called for genuine universal suffrage, for fear that the secret nature of the ballot might serve as a pretext for any restriction the non-democratic countries might wish to impose. This proposal was also struck down in a vote of 38 to 2. Saint-Lô also fought for the declaration to specifically state that it should fully apply to people of non-self-governing territories. He lent strong support to a Yugoslavian amendment that stated, "The rights proclaimed in this declaration also apply to any person belonging to the population of trust and non-self-governing territories." To objections that the universal character of the declaration would make such a clause redundant, Saint-Lô replied that a colonial application clause appeared in all international conventions signed by members of the United Nations, under the pretext that signatories could not impose their will upon colonies. That had, however, never prevented such powers from opposing their will when they had so desired. He again took on the role of a spokesman for colonized people, saying that most of those present had little idea of the feeling of exasperation and despair generated in people living under a colonial regime, and that the people of the non-self-governing territories all should be assured that they had the goodwill of the United Nations directed toward them. Again, in response to the French representative's insistence that the declaration applied equally to all people without drawing specific attention to colonial people, Saint-Lô said that it was surprising that countries which had had no experience of colonial conditions should attempt to lay down the law to those which had. He added that Haiti, as representing a number of similar states, had received many petitions asking that such an article should be included in the declaration. And he took another liberty in criticizing the colonial powers, saying, "It was strange to find the cry of freedom taken up in the committee by countries which had not had a good record in their dealings with non-self-governing territories." Ultimately, the Yugoslavian proposal passed, 16 votes to 14, with 7 abstentions. Finally, after months of debate in the Third Committee, the UN General Assembly came together on the 9th of December, and Émile Saint-Lô was tasked with presenting the declaration to the plenary session. In his remarks, he alluded to Haiti's connection to the progress of human rights. He thanked the delegations for having appointed him to bring before the Assembly the text of a Declaration of Human Rights, which, for the first time, was to be universal in scope, and for having thus associated his country with that historic act. Thus, in full awareness of his country's significance in the history of human rights, a Haitian played a significant role in crafting the document that has served as a point of reference for decolonization and self-determination over the subsequent decades. As a representative of the UN General Assembly, on the UN General Assembly, Saint-Lô also cast votes on the recognition of several new states. Most famously, he played a key role in the defeat of the Bevin-Sforza plan, which would have broken Libya up into 3 trusteeships administered by France, Britain, and Italy. He is also supposed to have aided the drafting of the constitutions of newly independent states, though I haven't been able to find any documentation about this so far. Another Haitian who worked for the United Nations and was instrumental in the organization's activities around decolonization of Africa was Max H. d'Orsainville. Like Saint-Lô, d'Orsainville was a representative to the UN in its early days, and he also served as rapporteur and chairperson on one of its main committees. D'Orsainville was the Haitian representative to the 4th Committee, the committee dealing with the decolonization and trusteeships. Here, he was involved in the oversight of the administration of territories, including Somalia, Togo, the Cameroons, Rwanda, Urundi, Tanganyika, and Southwest Africa and Namibia, as well as a number of Pacific islands. Generally, he was the only representative from a majority Black nation in those meetings. In the 1950s and 1960s, he led numerous UN missions to Africa. In these roles, he was directly involved with the process of decolonization in several African nations. The representatives of African countries constantly expressed their appreciation that a Black man from Haiti was in such an important role. For example, in 1958, d'Orsainville was the UN representative for the supervision of an election in French Togoland, which was a UN trust territory under French administration. d'Orsainville was lauded for his work organizing the election that brought Sylvanus Olympio to power, which was a major step in Togo's movement toward independence. Subsequent UN General Assembly session, the representative from Ghana commented that it was a source of pride to his country that it had been a representative of Haiti who had presided over one of the most significant episodes in Africa's history. At other times, however, d'Orsainville was less successful at representing the interests of Africans. In 1955, he led a visiting mission to the UN Trusteeship Council, In 1955, he led a visiting mission of the UN Trusteeship Council to Cameroon, which was also a trust territory under French administration. This mission met harsh criticism from the Union des Populations du Cameroun, a left-wing and anti-colonial political party that was being repressed by the French administration. In a letter to the UN General Assembly, the UPC, they explicitly criticized d'Orsainville for his failure to hear their grievances while in the country. He was judged particularly harshly in view of his Haitianness. The letter reads, "It is astounding and shameful that Monsieur d'Orsainville, the chairman of the mission, can back statements of the French government and ignore the sufferings of his Cameroonian brothers by supporting the dissolution of the UPC through his refusal to hear anyone from that party. It is also regrettable that Mr. d'Orsainville, in whose ability to carry out a serious investigation, the whole population of the Cameroons had full confidence because his skin is black like ours, because he is our brother, and because he is the representative of a former French colony, the Republic of Haiti, which had to endure the trials of colonization. So it is regrettable that he should be the man to betray our confidence, the confidences of his own government, and that he should have been unable to carry out properly the task entrusted to him." Another Cameroonian petition claimed that Monsieur d'Orsainville was corrupted by the French. His mind was poisoned by the offer of money, so that the mission made no further inquiry, that he made no mention of the bloodshed, the graves, the active members of the UPC who were languishing in various prisons, and he refused to accept the petitions submitted to him, while several of our compatriots were tortured in the presence of the visiting mission. Again, these serious accusations were all the more pointed because of the expectation that a Haitian would truly have an interest in the conditions of Africans, especially Africans living under French administration. d'Orsainville continued to sit on the Trusteeship Council, and he led many other UN missions to Africa, some more successful than others. He is certainly a key figure in Haiti's role in the decolonization of Africa. He is also, however, connected to the fraught history of supranational activities in the decolonizing and post-colonial world. Activities that have often been criticized for their neglect of human rights and their collusion with colonial or neo-colonial interests. As a founding member of the organization and with a highly educated middle class and the added advantage of Black skin, many Haitians served in important posts in the United Nations throughout the second half of the 20th century. Atema Belrive led a WHO medical team that included several Haitian doctors in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Maurice d'Artigue held many posts for the UN and UNESCO, including senior education specialist for the UN's trusteeship department and chief of UNESCO's African division. Herbert Peck was an FAO and UNESCO agronomist who taught agriculture at the University of Kinshasa for 24 years. But many Haitians also found their way to Africa on their own terms. And many of these contributed to the development of African countries at the national and grassroots level. The most well-known and well-documented of these are the numerous Haitians who settled in Dakar around the time the country won its independence. The late 1950s and early 1960s are a particularly interesting juncture in the joint histories of Haiti and Africa. In Haiti, François Duvalier came to power in 1957 and gradually eroded civil liberties in opposition to his regime, which provoked a mass exodus of Haiti's highly educated middle class. As opponents of Duvalier's anti-democratic regime, many of these exiles were progressives. At the same time, On the other side of the Atlantic, the continent of Africa was in the throes of decolonization. Many progressive Haitians finding themselves in limbo thought it only natural to make their way to Africa and get involved with the historic events taking place there. The distinction here, on the one hand, Haitians working through official channels like the UN and international diplomacy, presumably with the blessing of the Duvalier regime. And on the other hand, individual Haitians traveling to Africa on their own, sometimes in spite of the regime, merits further investigation. The current chapter, I hope, will lay a foundation for further research. For the final part of this presentation, I'm going to look at 4 Haitians who spent many years living in Dakar and worked toward nation building in newly independent Senegal. First, I'm going to describe how each of them came to Africa, and then I'm going to describe how individually and collectively they contributed. The first to arrive was the poet and journalist Gerard Cheney. Cheney was born in 1927. By the age of 19, he already had a reputation as an agitator. He helped organize a student strike that ultimately toppled the Lescaut regime and ushered in the revolution of 1946. Here he is with his friends. That on the left, that's Jacques-Steven Alexis, one of the famous Haitian novelists. He came to Canada in 1955, actually, to study architecture, but then he relocated to Europe, where he studied political science and African history. In 1957, François Duvalier came to power, and Cheney, as a well-known dissident, became persona non grata in his country. In 1958, Guinea became the first African colony to win its independence from France. Its leader, Ahmed Sékou Touré, called on the progressives of the world to flock to the country. Cheney obliged. For 4 years, he worked for the Institut Français d'Afrique Noire, studying African cultures. By 1962, Sékou Touré had taken on a dictatorial style, and Cheney decided to leave the country. By then, Senegal had also won its independence, and its president, Léopold Sédar Senghor, opened the country's doors to the African diaspora. So in 1962, Cheney relocated to Dakar. So now one of them has arrived in the city. 2 years later, another Haitian poet and radical journalist arrived in Dakar. This was Jean F. Brielle. Brielle was quite a bit older than Cheney. Born in 1909, he was a generation ahead. He had opposed the US occupation and was imprisoned for it. He later held diplomatic posts in the late 1940s and 1950s. But when Duvalier came to power in 1957, Brielle was once again jailed for criticizing the government. When he was released in 1961, he left the country, first for Jamaica and then for Senegal in 1964. He stayed in Senegal for over 2 decades. 2 years after Brielle arrived, another writer joined the growing Haitian community in Dakar. His name was Félix Mauricio Leroy. He was a poet and playwright and was most famous for his pioneering work in Creole language literature. Born in 1912, his anti-authoritarian outlook was shaped by his early years under the occupation. He worked as a teacher, newspaper editor, and civil servant, and established himself as a champion of Creole language education in Haiti. Something that I know a little bit about. In the 1950s, aware of the desperate need to bridge the linguistic divide in Haiti, Morisot wrote an adaptation of Sophocles' Antigone in Creole. The play was a success and had an impact on changing perceptions of Creole as a fully sophisticated language and not simply a vulgar dialect of French. By the time Duvalier came to power, Morisot had a reputation as a progressive. Just weeks after the election, Morisot left the country. He actually won a UNESCO Art Scholarship for a 6-month lecture tour in Europe, so the timing was propitious. He convinced the organizers to arrange for him to visit Dahomey while he was in Europe, to add a leg of the trip to Africa. While he was away, his friends told him he shouldn't return to Haiti or he would be arrested. Nonetheless, Morisot returned to the country in spring of 1958. He stayed for a year. He wasn't arrested, but he received regular threats as the administration made it clear that he was not safe. In 1959, his UNESCO connections helped him arrange to bring his theater troupe to Paris to perform his Creole version of Antigone, which he did at the Sarah Barnhart Theater, actually. He didn't return to Haiti for 27 years after this point. In Paris, Morisot Leroy actually met Léopold Sédar Senghor, who was on the cusp of becoming Senegal's first president. Morisot decided to return to Africa. First, he took a job teaching French in Nigeria. After a few months, he was invited to give a lecture on popular theater in Ghana. Kwame Nkrumah's government then appointed him National Organizer of Drama and Literature. When Nkrumah fell from power in 1966, Mauricio finally made his way to Dakar. He stayed in Senegal for 14 years. The fourth and final Haitian to settle in Dakar that I would like to mention was the actress Jacqueline Scotland. Scott Lemuan was born in 1923. She worked as a secretary and a TV and radio presenter in Haiti. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, she started to make a living as a stage actor. Like Mauricio, she was part of a popular theater troupe that performed Creole language plays for lower class and rural Haitians. When Duvalier came to power, her troupe was persecuted and its administrator was arrested. Finding the country unlivable, in her words, she left in 1962. She found a job in Paris in radio, but soon she was scouted by Aimé Césaire to star in his play about Haiti, La Tragédie du Roi Christophe. This was the role that brought her to Africa. As I mentioned at the beginning, the first Festival of Negro Arts took place in Dakar in April 1966. Black luminaries from across the globe convened in the city for 3 weeks of lectures, film premieres, and art exhibitions, and musical and theatrical performances, and Aimé Césaire was asked to stage a play for the event. He chose La Tragédie du Roi Christophe. As I noted, the performance is something of a red letter event in the history of Black internationalism generally, and in the connection between Haiti and Africa in particular. In the play, Césaire offers a warning about leaders who refuse to lead in the interests of the people. This was, of course, a timely warning for both Haiti under Duvalier and for the new African nations, many of which were heading toward kleptocratic authoritarian regimes. In particular, Césaire was leveling a criticism against and a warning for his old friend, President Senghor, who he believed was becoming too pragmatic, abandoning his earlier idealism and adopting modernizing projects from above without consultation with the masses. The performance was also a significant event for Jacqueline Scotland. In Dakar, she encountered the city's Haitian community and she decided to stay. She lived in Dakar until her death 45 years later in 2011. So now we have our 4 socially engaged Haitians in Dakar. You'll notice that each made their way to Africa along a different trajectory, as you can see. But each story can be described in similar terms. They all left Haiti or chose not to return to Haiti because of François Duvalier, and they all ended up in Dakar because of its reputation as a hub for French-speaking progressive members of the African diaspora. They each contributed to the new country in a variety of ways. Jean Brielle worked for the Ministry of Culture. He was involved in planning the 1966 Festival of Negro Arts that put Dakar on the map and brought Jacqueline Scotland and many others to the country. Brielle became one of the leading Haitian intellectuals of the second half of the 20th century, publishing poetry and scholarly articles and continuing to serve in the Ministry of Culture for many years. He returned to Haiti amid great fanfare after Jean-Claude Duvalier fell from power in 1986, and he died there 3 years later. Félix Morisseau-Leroy spent 14 years in Senegal. As in Haiti, Mauricio worked tirelessly to promote popular theater in local languages. He was made technical advisor for the Senegalese People's Theater. He continued writing plays and poetry in Creole, and he even adapted Antigone once more into Wolof. In 1978-1979, he spent a year's residency at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. He then returned to Dakar. In 1981, with failing eyesight, he retired in Miami, another home of a vibrant Haitian community. He returned to Haiti after Duvalier left the country in 1986, but he continued to live in Miami, though he returned to Haiti many times, and he died in 1998. Jacqueline Scotland was also involved in the cultivation of local theater in Senegal. She was a pensionnaire of the National Theater for 18 years. She appeared in films, she wrote a novel and a play. She also worked in radio and television, hosting a radio program called La Voix des Poètes, and presenting literary content on public television. She became a Senegalese citizen in 1976. When Duvalier fell from power in 1986, she chose to remain in Senegal, where she lived the rest of her life. When she died in 2011, Senegalese obituaries hailed her as une grande dame des arts et de la culture. Gerard Cheney worked for the history section of the Ministry of Scientific Research in Senegal. He too was involved in planning the Festival of Negro Arts. Cheney served as a cultural advisor for the Senegalese government for 25 years. In 1976, he accompanied President Senghor on an official visit to Haiti. On his arrival, Jean-Claude Duvalier had Cheney arrested, but Senghor intervened to have him released, something that I want to look more into. Cheney chose not to return to Haiti even after Duvalier fell from power in 1986. He lives to this day, as far as I can tell, It's a little bit hard to keep track of him, but he lives to this day in a village south down the coast from Dakar. Here, he opened a small hotel and an artist retreat called Sobobade. Now in his 90s, Cheney still lives in Sobobade, which continues to welcome visitors from around the world. So just a few final thoughts here. The perceived and real connections, the formal and informal links between Haiti and Africa developed over the course of the 20th century and shaped events and ideas on both sides of the Atlantic. Haitians have not always single-mindedly opposed domination of African peoples, but the existence of Haiti helped frame colonialism and decolonization in a longer historical context and fueled the light of dignity and self-determination across the continent. The presence of individual Haitians in various parts of Africa gave focus to these abstract ideas and served as living proof that African people could make their own way in the world. Despite the title of my presentation, the story doesn't actually end in 1986, although many Haitians returned home when Jean-Claude Duvalier fell from power in that year. Others, like Gerard Cheney and Jacqueline Scotland, Lemuan, remained in Africa, and still others went on to make the voyage. To conclude and to bring the story into the 21st century, I'm going to read a portion of a document produced in 2010. It was written by a committee of Senegalese political, military, religious, and civil society leaders and published in a Dakar newspaper 4 days after the Haitian earthquake of 2010. It reads, "We gathered today for a broad consultation on the dramatic situation experienced by the Haitian people in the aftermath of the earthquake of Tuesday, January 12, 2010, recognized as the largest earthquake ever recorded in its history. After having listened with great interest to the historical reminder made by Professor Ibader Thiam, who highlighted the major role played by the Haitians in the fight of the Black peoples for their liberation, the preservation of their dignity, and the refusal of colonial domination, headed by Toussaint Louverture, symbol of the resistance and the revolt of the Blacks. Being convinced that Haiti constitutes a sublime reference for the peoples of Africa and the diaspora because of its fierce struggle against the slave trade and colonial domination, its rejection of all justifications of civilizing missions, thus giving the first breath to the Pan-Africanist movement, being convinced that Africa, land of origin of Haitians transplanted by force and against their will outside the continent, cannot remain insensitive to the tragic fate that strikes the Haitian people today, we do decide to approve and carry everywhere in Senegal, Africa, and throughout the world, the fraternal message and the generous proposal for a right of return for Haitians and the creation, if they wish, of their own state on the land of Africa, land of their ancestors." Later that year, the Senegalese government brought 163 Haitian university students to Dakar to resume their education, which had been cut short by the earthquake. And so the story continues, but I will end it there for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was fascinating. I have lots of questions, but let me just see if others have hands up. I invite people to raise their virtual hand or turn their camera on, and I guess virtual hands really work best. I guess I'd love to hear more about the UN context and how Emile St. Lo was chosen, or d'Orsonville. Do you know from the records, were they sort of selected to say, we want a representative from a colonial nation, or we want someone from a majority Black nation, or are those decisions not evident in the archives?
So yeah, this is something that I'm really going to look more into. I've just been looking at UN records so far, so I don't really know the outside context. But Haiti was a founding member of the UN. There weren't really many, there weren't really Black independent nations in 1947. So Haiti was basically the Black independent nation, and therefore was asked to, was part of this whole founding of the United Nations. And I think on these committees, there was just a representative from all members, or from all member states. So Emile St. Lo was a politician, had experience with policy making and things like that. And like I said, sort of had this contentious relationship with Dumarsais Estimé. And a lot of times the presidents in Haiti, if there's like a well-respected public figure, but they don't really get along with them, they give them a diplomatic post somewhere. So I think that's probably what got him there initially. But he seems to have been suited to the job and took to it. And so I think that's why he ended up specifically there. But yeah, does that kind of answer your question?
Oh, well, I think it'd be tricky to kind of recover sort of other people's attitudes towards him as just, speaking on behalf of racialized people or whatever. But yeah, really, really interesting. Deb.
Hi, thanks, Matt. Really interesting paper. And my question is about, I think, bringing some of these different actors together under one umbrella. I'm wondering if there was a conscious effort or a consciousness of Haiti's connection to Africa, if there was internal discussions among, obviously not between the people from early in the century and later, but if there was an awareness of those connections for people who went to Africa later, and if there was a sense that there was a network, like internally, did they talk about a network of Haitians who were cosmopolitan, who were consciously trying to bring Africa closer? Were they collectively working on that? Because what I was thinking when you were giving your paper was there's a whole variety of people who go, but how were they connected to each other, and how were they connected to other diaspora, networks of cosmopolitan Africans in common projects? The UN stuff I thought was really interesting, but are there other ways that those connections were built?
Yeah, it's something that I'll be looking into again, and especially in the chapter I'm working on about Haitians in Paris. There was definitely obviously I'm sure everyone here knows there's long been a multinational, interconnected Black community in Paris, with people from the French Antilles, with people from the colonies in Africa, if we're talking about the beginning of the 20th century, and also Haitians. And just a quick shout out to the late Tyler Stovall, who I'm sure many of you even knew personally, but his book, Péri Noir, and the works of others, I've been really interested in learning more about that. I do notice that in a lot of those works, the Haitian element is kind of neglected. So this is going to bring some new dimensions to that. Like there's lots of people have spoken about even conflict between people from the colonies and people from the African colonies and people from the old colonies in the Caribbean. But there is, salons and things taking place where these people work together. They work on, there were Haitians involved with the Pan-African Congresses that were going on, and with the counter exhibition that, the famous counter exhibition, was it 1920? Was it around then sometime? And yeah, so there's certainly lots of places where these connections were taking place, but I don't have a ton of documentary evidence of it so far, but I'll be looking more into it for sure. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, it's just interesting from the point of view of, we think about these networks as being amongst people who are coming from the French Empire. And I'm just really, really interested to see how they react to the Haitian element, which of course has quite to say the least, a different history in the 19th and 20th centuries. So it's just a really interesting avenue to pursue.
For sure. Thanks, Deb.
Great. Eric Jennings.
Very interesting paper. Very quickly, I wonder to what extent you open with this wonderful story about Aimé Césaire, almost giving a word of warning. And I wonder to what extent that wording isn't tied itself to the double-edged sword that was Toussaint Louverture. I mean, after all, this is somebody who, is the great liberator, but he also makes himself leader for life. And do you find echoes of that in sort of the dictatorial potential of Sékou Touré, for instance?
That's a very good question. It's something that there's been a lot of writing about this tension in Haiti specifically. And even to this day, the dictatorial tradition that crops up in Haiti. So I'm going to be looking into the question of African leaders for the one chapter. This is one of the chapters that I've put the least work into so far. But yeah, it's definitely something. There's a really good article by, I can't remember her name. There's a book called Modernization as Spectacle or something like that. And there's a chapter in that about the play itself. So an article in that about the play itself, and how Aimé Césaire literally was just kind of trolling his friend, Leopold Senghor through this play. So yeah, it's something that was going on, and it's something that Aimé Césaire definitely seems to have been sensitive to. But yeah, I haven't done a ton of research. It seems to be my, I need to do more research generally. So, but yeah, did you have any other specific thoughts, questions on that, or?
No, thanks very much.
No worries.
Can I ask you about newspapers? Like, do you find, or have you been, I'm assuming that there are kind of West African newspapers that have been digitized. Do they kind of consciously describe the presence of, especially the section of, okay, this group of people in Dakar, I don't know. I'm just sort of interested in how you could get contemporary responses, but it may just really be ephemeral and difficult to track down. I mean, it seems like you've found a lot of visuals of these people and images and stuff, which is great. But I'm just thinking about,
Yeah, I mean, I was planning to travel to Paris and Dakar for research, but yeah, I've been having a very difficult time finding sources for what's going on in Dakar specifically. Actually, I really want to get in touch with Gerard Cheney because, as I said, he's still with us as far as I can tell. There's some interviews with him on YouTube from the last kind of couple of years. So I would love to get in touch with him, but have not yet been able to. So wish me luck with that, I guess. And hopefully I will be able to travel to Dakar, or at least get in touch with, some other grad students there that can help me with some of this research, but I haven't been able to get access to good digitized databases yet. There's a question in the chat. I don't know if just.
Yeah, it looks like I was going to say, Lindsay, the chat or the presentation is being recorded, so that will be available. And you can find Matt on the York History website or on LinkedIn if you want to email him. Oh, Alexia, would you pose a question?
Yeah, excuse me. I think my internet is a little bit bad, so just wave frantically at me if it doesn't work. Thank you so much for this talk. I thought it was incredibly rich and really well presented. So thank you very much. I'm not at all a specialist at this, but I just found it really interesting. So a couple little questions, I guess. The first one is how reliable do you think that figure is from the scholar you first, that 1896 is the first time that I know it's not yours, but just maybe how did the person calculate it, if you know, and do you really think that that's just the first one we can know about, or what? Just maybe just a little bit about that first figure, and I suppose another question about numbers is there. How well are the numbers of sort of the earliest periods as well of sort of the Haitian diaspora known, and are you able to kind of track that over time, just to give a context for kind of setting these particular figures in this broader movement and kind of very established tradition of elite and not so elite exile, from kind of Saint-Domingue as a political movement into the 19th into the 20th century. And then I guess a little bit about the mechanics of their movement. So this might come back to kind of some of the questions earlier about sort of where that, as Deb was putting it, right, sort of where these like transnational things interact with imperial and post-colonial networks. How are they getting, is it hard for them to get around? Individually, and then the degree to which that might be helped or hindered through French versus other imperial transnational networks. Is this something you even have access to? And then maybe a final thing just about I suppose just a discussion about your kind of method, and are your other chapters going to look like this in terms of kind of focusing on these biographies of these individuals? How are you thinking about kind of meshing these, exceptional cases in with I don't know, more general stories or not, or is it a series of exceptional cases all the way through? Just because, which would be, you have very good justification for doing that. It's not a criticism, it's just more a general question of interest about how you're thinking about the kind of story you want to tell and what you can do through this sort of, very concrete individual, but also sort of, it comes with its own limitations kind of biographical approach. So maybe a couple questions on approaches, and then some of these more general questions about the figures and where you could fit the story into bigger questions about the diaspora. So thank you.
Nice. So yeah, a lot of questions there. Do you want me to try to answer some of those, or was that just like anything specific that you, from all that?
From that, you'd like me to narrow that down? This is why the people see this is why do you ask a question? You're just gonna get put on the spot. Maybe if you know about this 1896 figure, about the first ones, if is there someone sailing on a ship before then that we just don't know about, or do you really think that's it? The first one that goes, and then maybe questions about just your general methodological approach to biography.
Okay, so yeah, we don't really know for sure. I assume that Haitians were traveling to Africa, the odd Haitian here or then before 1896. Like, I think that's pretty likely, because Haitians were traveling to Paris. Like, there were definitely mobile Haitians throughout the 19th century. And there was a Haitian on the Titanic, for instance, who died on the Titanic, which is, I know, a little bit later than the 19th century, but certainly Haitians were getting around into America, into Paris especially. And I wouldn't be surprised to find that there were Haitians traveling to Africa before 1896. And actually, just incidentally, we know that Benito Sylvain did travel to Africa, but a lot of his story is also kind of difficult to corroborate, because it's basically all just him talking about it. But that's kind of beside the point. But yeah, for sure, I think that's something that I'll be looking into for the period before that I'm sort of focusing on for these migrations. But on the other hand, Leo Francois Hoffman is a pretty widely respected. Actually, I think he passed away a couple of years ago as well. So, but he's a widely expected figure, and I took although he wrote this I guess 30 years ago now. So I'll be looking into more about that for sure. And as for methodology, yeah, I've honestly just been doing what I can so far. My first chapter, which is the other one that I've put a lot of work into so far, is not based on biographies like this. It's kind of a like an Edward Said kind of type analysis, where I'm looking at works of literature and other types of writings from actually all the way back to Columbus up to sort of the 20th century, what people thought about Haiti. So in the first chapter, I'm looking at like the memory of Saint-Domingue and how that inspired French colonialism. And so I'm basically doing an analysis of when Haiti pops up, because in this, I should kind of say is, it's building on Michel Wolfe-Trouillot, who I'm sure a lot of you know, his view that the Haitian Revolution was forgotten, but it's also kind of adding another angle to it, talking about how actually a lot of people did know and remember their most successful colony ever, Saint-Domingue, and it served, I found some pretty clear evidence that it served as kind of a rallying cry when the French started conquering Algeria initially in 1830, and then Western Africa later on. So the memory of Saint-Domingue was actually not as, and the memory of the Haitian Revolution even was not as silenced in France as we've been kind of assuming for the last 25 years or so. There's a lot of work on this as well, but so yeah, I'm taking more of a kind of a textual analysis, like a Edward Said style approach to just trying to understand what the French thought about Haiti and the memory of Haiti and how this functioned in their society, to encourage and build these arguments for colonialism as the country became more and more democratic. You had to actually convince people that these were good things. Like you couldn't, it wasn't, I guess initially with Napoleon, that's kind of what Napoleon III kind of relaunched French imperialism in Africa, but then the republics kind of carried on the tradition, obviously the Third Republic. So they had to make arguments for going into Africa and doing these types of things. They had to convince various factions in the society. Missionaries were part of that as well. And so I'm looking at how Haiti kind of existed, and the memory of Haiti and the memory of the Haitian Revolution existed in sort of the French public consciousness, I guess you could say. And then I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to research this because I haven't started yet, but I do want to know, like I said, for my second chapter, how did this actually impact what the French did in Africa? Like, how did it impact the way they dealt with, things like slavery in Africa, coerced labor? Like, does the memory of these massive, surely the memory of this massive slave uprising, this cataclysmic event in their history, had an impact on what they did, and that type of thing. So just a couple of thoughts, I guess.
There's a follow-up question, but which is just if you'd like to expand on Edward Said's approach in a sentence or two, and then we'll take Jeremy Popkin.
Sure. So I studied Edward Said in Deb Neal's class, who's here. Thank you, Deb. I knew about him before, but she gave me a leg up on the literature. But basically, Edward Said talked about how writings like literature and history aren't politically neutral. So he specifically kind of focused initially on ideas about the Orient. His famous book, Orientalism, 1978, I think, was that Europe sort of built this knowledge of the Orient, and then through all kinds of writing, through novels, and through history and scientific writing even, they built up this knowledge of the Orient, and that knowledge gave them the permission from their perspective to dominate that part of the world. We actually, Europeans were thinking, we actually know more about your country, your culture than you do, or you think you do. So that gives us the right to come in and colonize. And Edward Said said that we could learn more about this by reading novels and reading them sort of against the grain. And he looks at Rudyard Kipling and Jane Eyre, or sorry, Jane Austen and things like that, and shows that colonialism was going on in the background, and ultimately the perspectives that kind of underlie all British and French literature he was mostly concerned with served to support colonialism in a variety of ways. Is that right, Deb? Is that pretty accurate? Okay.
Very
and then,
nice capsule. All right, Jeremy Popkin, please.
Thank you. I'm Jeremy Popkin from the University of Kentucky. I apologize that I only caught the second half of your talk, so you may have discussed, it sounds from the comment you just made, that you may have discussed some of this from in the first part of your remarks, but I was trying to think what anybody, an African student, for example, who goes to Paris in the early 20th century would have learned about Haiti and the Haitian Revolution. The histories of French colonialism that are published in those years mostly describe the loss of Saint-Domingue as a terrible disaster. It's like Vladimir Putin talking about the breakup of the Soviet Union, and their portrayal of post-independence Haiti is almost entirely negative. So it would have been something of a challenge to get a more accurate picture, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I should say, first of all, I'm a fan of your work, Dr. Popkin.
Thank you.
I studied one of your books in my undergrad, and it it was somewhat formative. So thank you.
Uh,
Yeah, that's definitely something that I'm wondering about personally. Education is being spread to Africa even at this point. I want to find curriculum documents, textbooks that obviously try to hush up the Haitian Revolution in some way, because you can't teach kids in Chad or the French Sudan. You can't teach them about the Haitian Revolution.
I would think not. Yes.
I'm certain that African people coming to Paris would have encountered this narrative. And I know that, for instance, C.L.R. James's book was translated into French. I think it was published in the 30s, published in French, translated into French, I think in the 40s. So I want to know, like,
after World War II.
I'm sure it got to Paris. Did it get to Africa? And to what extent did African people know about about Haiti, about the Haitian Revolution? So that's
one more thing before I log off. My colleague in my department, Hilary Jones, is doing research on connections between the French Caribbean and Africa in the 19th and early 20th century. It might be somebody you would want to be in touch with.
Sure, Hilary Jones.
Hilary Jones.
She did the
book on the métier of Senegal.
Yeah, yes. I read that book in my PhD as well. That's
She's an excellent colleague. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. And Alexia just kind of extends that discussion by saying the point in your discussion about the UN human rights working groups were aware of and prioritized Haiti's tradition in advancing human rights. So recognize the importance of St. Lo. So
yeah, I found some of the records on that pretty surprising as well. It was just pretty explicit, like Haiti is important. I just wouldn't expect to have seen that in UN records from right at the founding.
Right.
Well, you must have seen that a number of Latin American countries play an important role in the drafting of the Universal Declaration. So Haiti is kind of in that
for sure
context too.
Yep.
All right, I think we have time for one or two more questions. William.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Matt. I was wondering, wasn't something that you brought up in your talk, but I'm wondering if it's something that is going on in your dissertation, and if maybe you could say a little bit more about it today. Your kind of mention of how not just Haitians having kind of presence in Africa as part of your focus, but also kind of the idea of Haiti and the legacy of the Haitian Revolution. And I'm also wondering maybe about the ideas of some Haitian thinkers, authors. One of the people that I was wondering about, I only know, so Antenor Firmin, the 19th century person who did many things, but particularly wrote a very strong kind of criticism of scientific racism.
Sur l'égalité des races humaines. Yeah.
Ouais, c'est ça. And seeing the kind of, I know the content of it much more than I know the reception of it or the influence or how it was picked up. And so I was kind of wondering about if a work like that had kind of echoes or ramifications, if it was something that became part of a kind of anti-racist, anti-colonial tradition or body of thought, particularly in Africa that you're looking at, and the kind of, in a sense, the kind of role of this Haitian intellectual in any number of relevant kind of intellectual topics and political kind of questions that are relevant in the time period that you're looking at.
Yeah, something that I'm learning more about. So Antenor Firmin was an Haitian anthropologist, early 20th century, and he was actually a political presidential candidate at one point. And yeah, he wrote this book, kind of a rebuttal of Gobineau's Sur l'inégalité des races humaines, just titled Sur l'égalité des races humaines. And yeah, I actually am not super familiar with the content and the response either. I think it kind of had some traction in the US and kind of impacted like the Harlem Renaissance and Pan-Africanist movements that were going on. but I don't know a whole lot about that specifically. I will be looking into it. But a person that for sure is acknowledged as having had an impact on thought in Africa is Jean-Brice Mars. Jean-Brice Mars was a doctor and an ethnologist, and he's the father of Haitian indigenisme, which I mentioned partway through, which is this idea that emerged during the occupation in a response to this kind of American civilizing mission. There were two responses. I've written a little bit about this, so if you'll indulge me. There was a very much like a Francophile response, which said like, we don't need your culture, United States. We have French culture. Like French culture is superior to American culture. So there was this one response, which you can see in the literature and different writings and things like that. But there was also this completely opposite response, which was just a total rejection of kind of Western standards, and which began kind of an internal kind of a soul searching in Haiti, thinking about, like I said, their African heritage and showing that there is value to the things that we do that we got from Africa and things like that. And there's indigenous poetry and there were newspapers and things like that. And Jean-Brice Mars was kind of the father of this. And he also spent a lot of time in Paris. So I'm going to be talking about him in the Haitians in Paris chapter. And it's acknowledged, you can see references to, she was kind of a little bit older than like the Negritude guys. And so it's been pointed out that, and even by them, they acknowledged that he was sort of foundational in the development of their thinking around like the value of African culture, the value of thinking about things from the African perspective and things like that. So that's another an example that I do know a little bit more about. But yeah, I'll be looking into Filman for sure.
If I could just ask a follow-up as well, if we have a sec. Thinking about him as well made me wonder about kind of complex situation of civilization and kind of the ways that there could be binaries of kind of, colonial being opposed to African, or some people, as you're saying, kind of who were both advocates of some French civilization or idea of French civilization, while also being, working in Africa in a way that, you kind of were presenting as maybe him falling in some ways on either side of a binary. And I'm wondering if it's always so divided amongst, historical actors. I'm not sure, but I know Firmin, for instance, thinks about and establishes or tries to kind of argue for the idea of, kind of a Black African presence in ancient Egypt, and that being important at this kind of root of civilization and Greek civilization. And, it's part of an argument to say that like Western civilization or the civilization of the colonizer is not simply theirs from the perspective of sub-Saharan Africa. It's also where there's some role here that Africans, particularly Black Africans in Egypt, played, that it's not a necessarily, simply this kind of binary, and there can be a reappropriation in various creative ways. I'm wondering if you see any of that in the kind of work of the actors themselves, historical actors who are kind of, thinking about and negotiating the relationship, particularly with the, this, civilization of the colonizers that they are kind of trying to think through and relate to.
Yeah, for sure. That's good stuff. I guess generally, I think I see from what I've seen, this like binary was pretty strong early on, like as you might expect. And I think still Haitians kind of challenged the binary a little bit. Like I said about Benito Sylvain, he was on the one hand, like he thought he was imbued with Western civilization, but he also kind of stood outside of it a little bit and was able to kind of mitigate between the two sides if there were sides. At least he attempted to. But yeah, as I said, like the binary really seems to kind of taper away and collapse a little bit as things move forward, from what I can tell. But yeah, it's definitely worth thinking about. I'm not sure what else to say about it, but
All right. Well, Matt, you've been in the hot seat for a good amount of time. Are there any final questions, compliments? I want to take a moment just to invite everyone who's here to join us in a couple of weeks. On February 11th, we'll have Julie Hardwick from the University of Texas giving a talk, A Foundling's Garter and 18th Century Family Histories Between Sex in an Old Regime City and the Paraphernalia of Precarity. So that draws on her book from last year. So,
Sorry, if Margaret, if I could just say as well, I think actually Julie's going to be doing a kind of hybrid, developing some, relating some to her book, and also some new material. So it'll be kind of interesting, you know, some
excellent, great,
revisiting and pointing towards some other things. So.
Fantastic. Great. Well, thank you again, Matt. We really were fascinated to hear a window into your research, and wish you well with this archival puzzle of not being able to travel. You have done admirable work sitting at home. Yes, and thanks to everyone for a lively conversation, and stay warm out there, and we will see you again, hopefully for future talks.